This is my Halo exploding Warthog diorama, and I'm going to show you exactly how I made it. So this diorama is inspired by some of the reveals for the multiplayer and campaign that have been out there. This scene especially.
Chief, is that you?
You're safe now.
And they just came out with this scene. "You're safe," he says, and promptly drives straight off a cliff. I don't see how he lands, but there's a lot of falling in the trailers. So I wanted a really vertical diorama. And it has to include not just the Master Chief and a Warthog, because I have them, but also the pine trees, the rock faces, and all that beautiful scenery, along with silver hexagons that are all part of Halo Infinite. So let's get started. This is my world of Halo Warthog. Great, the Master Chief fits in it. Almost, he's a bit of a struggle. But it's a bit shiny. Time to dirty it up. First up, I took it apart. I also drilled out holes for LED headlights. The first giveaway, this is a plastic model, is how shiny it is. It just looks fake. And they put loads of fake silver scratches, I guess. They're a little overdone. So I sanded. I used a magic sponge. It's a melamine sponge. You're supposed to use it for cleaning your kitchen, but it's a really fine, cheap way, and it gets destroyed doing this. I also used some sort of sanding sponges in sort of 800 and 1200 to try and just take this down to something that looks a little bit less plastic, and then you don't even need to paint it. Good weathering is more than one layer. First of all, you get the dust that's in all the cracks, then you build up the mud. In this instance, I used dilute oil paints. This is just an oil paint, a dusty coloured one with some terps, because I love the smell, and I plastered it everywhere. And when I say plastered, I mean plastered. Now that's great for the underneath, but the top needs a bit more finesse. So I didn't just plaster the top, I flicked. These are oil paints going on and they're being flicked over a cocktail stick. You need to thin them a bit with terps first, but then they spray on beautifully. And what's great about these, if you don't like them, they're too big, you got your flicking wrong, they come off with just a bit of dilute terps and another clean brush. More oils around the wheel wells where the mud would kind of splatter back. And a few more slightly more dilute splatters on the windscreen, so the Master Chief, bless him, he can still actually see out. Despite the fact they've put silver paint all over it really weirdly, I did add a bit more just to bring out some worn textures on areas they'd missed. I also got his feet dirty. Now you could stop there, but I want my mud caked on. It just still looks a bit shiny. So out come the pigments. These are just normal pigments. You can get them for modelling, for military, for trains. There's just so many places you can get them from. And in the little shot glass is isopropyl alcohol because it dries quickly and it's a carrier. Now, this isn't fixed. If you rub this Warthog at the end, it comes off. So this is great for things that aren't going to be touched a lot. Otherwise, you need to spray some matte varnish on there or something at the end. But I didn't want to. I just wanted to put him up there, and if I want to change the mud around a bit in a while, I can do it. So the underneath was yet again a complete lack of finesse, and I just plastered it everywhere. But I did make a bit more effort on the top. And as it dries, you get that lovely dusty effect. Time to turn on the lights. I had to drill a couple of holes at the back so I could get the wires out. I put them on a plug later so I can unplug and plug them to remove the Warthog. Then I glued the LEDs in place, soldered up the wires, tidied up the wiring, put it all back together, and yeah, I've got 2 screws left. How does that happen? The Master Chief got the shine taken off him with those magic sponges, and I added some panel lines to bring out the details. You won't see those nasty holes on the side of his legs, so I'm not worrying about them, which makes me wonder why I'm putting panel lining on his feet, but I know it's there. Basically, panel lining is just a dilute enamel wash that goes into all the cracks and crevices and just makes them look a little bit darker so all the details stand out a lot more. So with the Master Chief done, I just did the same on the guns. It just looked a bit blur without some extra pop on those details. In my head, the Warthog is flying through the air. In reality, it's really, really heavy and I've got to support it. And I want it to be removable so I can spray explosion paint, etc. around. So out came the 3D printer and I had a custom design support, which almost worked. Now the base is mostly foam and this was not going to stand up on its own. So I drilled some holes in the base and used knurled nuts. These are amazing things. They're basically ridged on the outside with a screw thread on the inside. You heat them up with your soldering iron and push them into your 3D print, which is a thermoplastic, so it melts, and then you can put a bolt in there and secure it to something. But what to bolt it to? Because I'm using foam for almost all my dioramas. So out came the base plate of my broken Anycubic i3 Mega. It's perfect for this, but a little bouncy in the middle, so I did actually put some 3D printed supports down the centre section as well. But that wasn't the only bouncy problem. It goes on beautifully, but everything just starts to lean and sag. Partly because the glue is giving way. I don't know if it was just old glue, but it's had its 5 minutes and then some, but it's still not 100% set at this point, so it's starting to just move slightly. And also it's a very, very heavy Warthog, and just there wasn't enough support on the angle because I want there to be an explosion under there. Easily solved. Of course, when someone on a video says something was easy, you don't see how many hours of thought went into the final result. In this case, it actually was quite easy. I drilled a couple of holes in the top and screwed in some extra screws just to support that top onto the base, and melted a big screw in as a brace on this corner. Result, job done. It worked. Time to get on with the base. This is just foam you get out of skips in the area where your builders are doing work. So I have tons of this stuff reclaimed during lockdown as everybody had all their houses extended. Brilliant. I do ask them and they just yell at me as I walk up the road that they've got it in the skip. I made sure that the wheels of the Warthog sat on it though for a little bit extra support. Copious amounts of hot glue secure it to the base, but I did add the screws in just to make sure it wasn't going to move. Then I carved everything with a box cutter and I used a brass brush to knock off any sharp edges or weird bits. And then I glued loads of the offcuts at the bottom to create some sort of fallen rock and raised area to the side. I just wasn't feeling it though. It didn't look like a rock face. I attacked it a bit more, I carved it a bit more. Maybe the next layer will help. Now, because this diorama is massive, it's made up of multiple pieces of foam and I tied them together with Sculpt-to-Mold. It's a plaster paper mache mix and it's great for stuff like this. But it's quite expensive and it's not the final finish that I want. So I turned to my faithful friend, tile grout. Some water, some PVA glue to prevent it cracking, and I created a paste. This is a taupe tile grout, but a grey would work as well. So I covered the surface in it using kind of a dabbing motion to try and get a bit of texture in there. I was being impatient though, and the sculpture wasn't dry, so I kept pulling it off. So I had to leave that bit and then come back and do a second coat and cover everything. I still wasn't happy, so I got out some water and a paintbrush and tried stippling the texture. Still no. So I left it all to dry up whilst I got on with something else. A distinctive feature of Halo Infinite are the hexagons. They're like big silver columns that are the building blocks for the ring itself that this is all living on. And I put a big one to the side and I wanted to do some smaller ones to the front. I made them out of card and foam for the end caps. I just hot glued everything together. I filled any unsightly gaps, made sure that the foam was sealed and used a spray putty to create a nice smooth effect. My first silver spray coat was a little bit meh, so I sprayed more spray putty and sanded again. Finally, I was happy and I was able to cut them a hole and put them in place. There's 3 at the front, 1 at the side, and then the big one, which also got some screws. Back to the rock face and more tile grout glue and water. This time it's much thicker and I used it to fill up any holes and start to form a better rock face. I wanted it to be slightly more angular with smooth, flatter faces. It took a second coat before I was happy. And just as an aside, I normally use plaster rock moulds or something like that. And I couldn't in this case because it was just too big. And the ones I have are for HO, they're 1:87. And this is much, much larger. It's about an 18th and it just looked wrong. To get the ground surface at the top, I stippled with a paintbrush and sprayed it with water just to smooth it all out. To add a bit of variety to the colours, I dry brushed on some artist acrylic paints in medium grey and Wedgwood blue before finally spraying it with a brown acrylic wash just to tone everything down. The top has some sparse vegetation, so I put on a bit of tile grout just to get a better texture. Followed up with a sprinkling of fine turf by Woodland Scenics in green blend and then earth blend. Before misting on some wet water, this is isopropyl alcohol and water, about a third isopropyl alcohol, helps the glue to flow. And then misting on the glue, which is dilute matte Mod Podge, about a sixth matte Mod Podge. Anything more than that and my spray bottles just won't spray through it. Finally, static grass. I used grass glue and then a short layer of a bright green Knock Spring as a base filler for the grass. Then I added a layer of longer grass using layering spray, it's just a spray adhesive, followed by 12mm grass. This is actually quite hard to get to stand upright with a normal applicator because it is very long, so it doesn't get a lot of charge, but a hoover will help it stand upright if you hoover it back up at the end. And now for the fun bit, the explosion. I was really chuffed how this came out, to be honest. It's my first ever explosion that I've done, and it was really simple. The big problem was working out how to support it. And a lot of people seem to use chicken wire. I hate chicken wire. It attacks me. It leaves holes in my arms. And yeah. So I went with two main things. A bonsai wire, which was far too soft and flopped, but it was, the only thickish wire that I had. And a thermoplastic clear warbler. Basically, this means if you heat it up, it moulds. Now, on its own, it's quite floppy, but you can fold it in half and it will not be floppy anymore. I chose it because it's clear and I wanted to be able to put the LEDs through it and diffuse them slightly. I think in hindsight, I worried about diffusion far too much. But once I was done, I had a really odd looking explosion structure. Time to add the light. Now, I had a massive false start with individual yellow LEDs, which you'll see in this, but they didn't add anything. All the light really comes off these 12-volt LED strips. They're very easy to use. You can cut them up into sections of about 3 LEDs, and it's just plus and minus on the wiring. You wire them all together. I used copper strip on a bit of card, and then you can easily put them into a 12-volt transformer pack that goes into the wall. Very, very simple. I also did the yellow ones because I thought they would add brightness at the end of the explosions. But in reality, they're a different voltage, 3 volts, so I had to put in a different power pack, which I used a micro USB and stepped it down to 3 volts, and then added a resistor because I blew the first lot, because these aren't actually 3 volt, they're 2 volt. I need to learn to read the packs better because I thought they were 3 volt. I even added some extra white LEDs into the middle because I was worried there wouldn't be enough light at the centre of the explosion. But by the time I diffused and done all the cotton wool and everything for the explosion itself, I think these were just a big red herring and a massive waste of time. Still, you live and learn. I tested as I went along and I tested at the end to make sure it works. I'm about to encase this and I'll never be able to get into it again without ripping apart my explosion. Then I tidied up that rat's nest of wiring. There's just so much wiring in this. Tidied it all up and put on diffusion material. I'm not entirely convinced I needed this diffusion material, but it's plate packing material. When you move house, you wrap your plates in it. And it's useful. It stops the LEDs being spotty and makes them more diffuse. It also is a great base for the next stage, cotton wool. Cotton wool is the simple material that elevates this ball of LEDs into an explosion. And all you need to do is plonk it on top. It's really, really simple. I used a cheap roll of cotton wool, which is a little bit bitty, so it has a little bit more texture to the explosion. And I put that on the basic ball, and for all the bits coming out, I used little cotton balls, which are much finer and smoother, so they give a little bit of a different texture. Not sure it really shows, but it made me feel good that I'd gone to so much thought about my cotton wool. So then I just used tacky white glue. It's a little bit thicker than normal glue to glue it all on. Of course, there is a little bit of finessing. If you do little balls like I'm doing here, the gaps between the balls will be brighter when you turn the lights on because there's less thickness. So you get a very cracked, bubbling explosion effect. For the bits shooting out, I tend to go with a more wrinkled effect with those cotton balls. I am ridiculously happy every time I turn the lights on these. I just love these explosions. So, enough geeking out over the explosions, time to paint them. I used acrylic inks because they're easy to spray. They're slightly translucent and you don't need to thin them, and I'm lazy. Just put them through my airbrush. I don't think you could hand paint this. It just doesn't work. And I sprayed the cracks yellow because that's where the lighter bit's going to be. Basically, most things went yellow. Now that was quite a lemony yellow, so I went over it with a more orange yellow, still all yellow, and I made sure I covered everything because I just don't want any white showing through at the end. I added in some red to the yellow and started to spray the centres of all the clouds with this colour. I built it up carefully because I did an experiment with a much more red colour and it looked awful. Finally, I added some black just for the sooty centre of the explosion. I checked the lighting and then posted some photos to Instagram. I had some great feedback that it wasn't red enough, and despite my initial problems with the red, the next morning I came back and added in some more, and it looked so much better. So we're on to the final stages. On went the Warthog, on went the explosion, and I added an ice cream tub covered in cotton wool to the back to hide all the electrics. It actually holds the explosion on, so this can all come apart if needed. We have Warthog lights, we have an explosion, but we have that messy light leak at the bottom. Time to do it all again. Now this bottom explosion is quite a bit more red because I did it somewhere different to this. I didn't do it here because this was in the way. I did it in my airbrush booth and the lighting's different, point to note. So the bottom has a nice red explosion and it's lighter towards the top. And you can see when the lights come on which one you prefer. I actually think I like it with a bit more red in it. As a finishing touch, I planted some trees that were left over from my last Halo diorama. They're a little bit small in scale, but at least they're not going to get singed by the explosion. This was great fun to do, but just like a real explosion, it actually gets quite hot, and some of my cotton wool has started to expand almost, and you can start to see the white coming through on the cracks. So just a warning, don't leave explosions like this on for a long time. They are heating up with the LEDs, and it is, I guess, fairly flammable, so you don't want your own live explosion. But I must take this opportunity to thank my patrons and my YouTube channel members. Without them, I wouldn't be doing this. It's a passion and they enable me to do things like this to share with you. And talking of sharing, my next diorama is going to be a Mongoose water splash from Halo. Basically, Halo again, it comes out in 8th of December. Really looking forward to it. So if you enjoyed it, you know the drill. Subscribe, hit the bell button, do all those sorts of whizzy things, and I'll let you finish off with a few more photos and see you next time.